You have written several articles on the opioid crisis. And in particular, you had one earlier this year that focused specifically on fentanyl and kind of profiled two different families, I guess, grappling with the aftermath of fentanyl overdoses. And I really want to start there because, we were just talking about how the US has passed an extremely grim milestone of, over 100,000 deaths in the time span of a year. The vast majority of those have been due to fentanyl. So I guess, bringing you in, you've been reporting on this issue for a while, and as you've pointed out in your articles, you have a personal connection to these stories as well. So I want to ask you. Was this inevitable? Or perhaps, a more specific way of breaking it down is, was there something in particular about the pandemic and the past 12 months that really precipitated this spike?
I think that, first of all, thank you for having me on. And Ariella, that was great. That was really informative, and I thought very well put. And I agreed with everything that you said. Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about the connection between COVID-19 and the spike in drug overdoses. In all honesty, I don't think that anybody fully understands the connection because I think that it's probably too complicated and too multifaceted. Individual reporters or investigators or public health researchers are gonna latch on to particular tendrils of what is ultimately a very complicated web, I think. And so people are starting to float theories about the connection between the two. First of all, it's undeniable. I mean, it's undeniable that there's an explosion in overdose deaths that links up perfectly with the pandemic. I don't think that anybody who's interested in this topic believes that this would have happened were it not for the first two waves of the opioid crisis. First, the legitimate, prescription pharmaceutical opioid crisis fueled, of course, by the Sacklers and Purdue Pharma and others. And then following that, the rise in, black market heroin use and abuse and overdoses in the wake, which is obviously intimately connected, laying the groundwork for the current crisis, which is one of primarily synthetic opioids, including chief among them fentanyl. So if the pandemic had happened in a vacuum where the first two waves of the opioid crisis hadn't happened, I'm not entirely sure that we'd be looking at what we're looking at now. But it did. And I don't think we can say that there was simply a third wave coming and it's totally random that it happens to coincide with the coronavirus pandemic either. It's clearly been intensified. So it's basically two streams combined into this particular river that we're looking at. When I took a stab at it in May, I wanted to focus, to be honest, I went into this piece that I wrote, I didn't really have like a thesis that I was trying to support. I actually just wanted to talk to two families about what they had experienced, and it became clear to me as I was writing that piece that the major commonality between these two families was that the young men in question who had overdosed on fentanyl both had experienced right before they had overdoses. One was fatal, the other one wasn't. They had experienced ruptures in their work life. Both young men, Max and Axel, had really rocky starts to being workers in the world. Lots of unemployment, working at a pizza place or as a delivery driver or, informal construction labor. And in both cases, they had found pretty decent jobs, which had helped stabilize them. Axel had found a job as a UPS worker, and it was the best job that he had had. His dad said as much, that it sort of filled him with a lot of, a sense of purpose and a feeling of being valued. I think a lot of people maybe wouldn't feel that way about their UPS job, but Axel had struggled with addiction and had not had a job that was that stable or well paid before. And because of coronavirus, he was sent home from it, and it precipitated a relapse, which resulted in a fatal overdose on fentanyl. And Max's case is somewhat similar in the sense that he had finally found a good job. He went to vocational school and he started working on trucks as a mechanic. mechanic, but he was let go from that job because he had already developed a drug habit, which was interfering with his performance. And once he was let go was when his drug use really spiraled, resulting inevitably in his overdose on fentanyl, because fentanyl is increasingly in the drug supply. This is in Providence, Rhode Island. So Max's story actually happens a little bit earlier than the coronavirus crisis, because fentanyl has been really bad in some communities on the East Coast for a while. It's making its way to the West Coast now, in bigger numbers than we've seen before. But in places like Providence, it's been around for a minute. So the commonality that I saw there that I thought maybe held some explanatory power for understanding why overdose deaths have really exploded during the pandemic is that when you have large numbers of people who are alienated from their work, who are socially isolated from each other, and when you have communities that are pretty threadbare, when people don't necessarily know why they're alive, to put it kind of grimly, and are really kind of holding on to whatever's available. And then you have a massive disruption that takes away what people are holding on to. You're going to see people sink into patterns that are really dangerous. And maybe perhaps that's always been true. I think that if you look back in history at, like the coincidence of like mass unemployment, alcoholism, we could argue that's always been true. But when you add on top of that, a synthetic opioid that is deadly, being completely unregulated in the black market, being dosed out in doses that can easily kill a person and often do, then you're going to see a crisis like the one that we have on our hands right now. So that was the aspect that I wanted to highlight, simply because it seemed obvious to me from talking to these two families that was the commonality. I should say, in case people haven't read my article, Fentanyl is the Genie That Won't Go Back in the Bottle, which I wrote in May. I should say that the reason why I wanted to write this is because I met two dads, essentially, and they're both in the same band. They're both in like a folk rock band called Consuelo's Revenge in Providence, and both of their sons overdosed on fentanyl. Their sons did not know each other and did not run in the same social circles. And I managed to speak to both of the dads, and it sort of really drove home that coincidence. It's really not a coincidence. It's evidence of the extensiveness of the problem. And I should say also, very sad news has come in the last week, which is that one of the main sort of like structuring devices of the piece is that one of these young men lived and the other one died. But in the last week, the young man who I interviewed for the piece, Max, who survived his fentanyl overdose, has died of a fentanyl overdose. So now both of the young men that I profiled in this article have died of a fentanyl overdose. And, Max, like I said, his original fentanyl overdose that prompted this article happened prior to the pandemic. But sadly, his fatal overdose has occurred squarely during the pandemic. So he sort of joins, very unfortunately and tragically, he joins that large, massive statistic that's the reason for us coming together and talking today.
Oh, that's awful to hear. I'm so sorry about that. I think you're right to point out that the employment opportunities that they got really provided a structure, a sense of meaning. They can create a sense of community. And I wanted you to kind of go into that because I see it as twofold. You talked about Axel getting an opioid treatment through his job. And I think that it's not emphasized enough, writ large, that we really have barriers to care. And most of them are employment based. And so if you are an employed person, you receive, a litany of benefits that include paid leave, holidays, access to types of medical care, et cetera, et cetera. And many times, people are also being injured on the job. And so their job is kind of providing them with this sort of back and forth in and out of medical procedures and so forth. But the other part is social and more sort of centered in self-esteem and self-valuation, feeling as though you're important to others and that other people care about you because you matter to them. And it seems like the story of Axel and Max is kind of a perfect encapsulation of both of those sides. Can you talk about how they inform each other and how they did when you were speaking with them?
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. And in fact, I've been thinking about this a lot lately. I mean, I think that in an ideal world, people wouldn't work so much because we would simply allocate work differently on the basis of social need, on the basis of problems that we would like to have solved in our society. And that's how we would decide who works on what, instead of just leaving it up to the market and everybody has to hope that they find work in order to, like, afford the means of their own survival. So in a grand sense, I think that socialists should be like skeptical of the idea that work should be too central to human identity necessarily. But in the meantime, the truth of the matter is that, like, the world appears to many people to be coming at the seams, and things that were solid, things that in previous times have been major sources of identity and self-esteem and meaning, have begun to fray at the seams quite rapidly. And work can be very degrading and very dehumanizing and very alienating in many ways. But it's kind of, there's a contradiction there. I mean, work is also, for many people, it's the main thing that keeps them going. It's not just a way for them to afford to put food on the table. I mean, we have to be honest about the fact that for many people, what's the quote? The worst, the only thing worse than being exploited by your boss is not being exploited by your boss, right? And for many people, I think, who've had, traumatic experiences trying to navigate life under capitalism, as I think both Max and Axel did in their early 20s, as people who either barely went to college or didn't go to college at all and didn't really entirely know what they were doing, which is the majority of people's experience in the United States after they graduate high school. Finding decent jobs that they could show up for and do a good job at and talk to people on the job and get a kind of like pat on the back and a paycheck was tethering them to reality and giving them a reason to not chase that high, essentially. I mean, I have in the piece, I have a quote from Max. I'll scroll down and find it real quick. He says, and this is sad to read out loud, knowing that Max has died just in the last, I don't think it's been a week actually since Max died, maybe about a week. He said, "I'm not the most confident person," is what he told me when I interviewed him, "but being high made me more confident." Simple as that. He just, like, being high made him more confident. Well, also working at his job made him more confident. Like, working as a mechanic on trucks made him more confident. But when he lost that job, obviously getting high was like the only available substitute. So I think we have to understand that there are psychological factors here. It's not just that people are getting physically addicted, though that is true. It's that physical addiction is compounded with an inclination toward the alleviation of psychic pain in a society that is, in many places in the country, rapidly deindustrializing, in a society where opportunities for career advancement and personal real self-realization through your job is like disappearing for a lot of people, and where non-work related things that give you meaning, like the ability to like have a wonderful community and a family and so on, are not available to people. So we have psychological and physical reasons for mass addiction, and underlying all of that, I would say, naturally, I would say this, are material reasons. Like the reasons why there's mass deindustrialization in certain places in the country is because the companies that have traditionally employed people there are searching for new places, often outside of the country, to find labor that is cheaper so that they can maximize their profits. At the same time, it's like a vice being squeezed from both sides. At the same time, that, as Ariella said, you have companies that are actually seeking to prey on and exploit those same communities by pumping them full of drugs that will fill the hole in their lives, whether that's like healing making the physical pain go away or making the psychic pain go away.
If you like this video from the Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.